Have you ever been treated like you didn't belong, by your own family? I spent 40 years sacrificing everything for my son. I built the house he grew up in. Paid for his college. Helped him start his business. And when life knocked him down, I was always there. But on Thanksgiving, all I wanted was to sit beside my 9-year-old grandson. Instead, my daughter-in-law's mother stood up, slapped me across the face, and screamed in front of everyone. Poor people eat outside. Nobody defended me. Not my son. Not my daughter-in-law. Not even the relatives I had known for years. They all looked away. Until my 9-year-old grandson slowly stood up, looked directly at her, and said one sentence that exposed a secret buried for 25 years. And before that dinner ended, the entire family had fallen apart. The cold November wind carried the scent of fallen leaves through the quiet streets of Maplewood, Connecticut. Every house glowed with warm lights, and families hurried inside with trays of food, laughter spilling through open front doors. But Arthur Bennett wasn't thinking about turkey or pumpkin pie. He was thinking about one little boy. His 9-year-old grandson, Ethan. Arthur carefully adjusted the small gift box resting on the passenger seat of his old blue pickup truck. It wasn't expensive. There was no fancy wrapping paper or shiny ribbon. Inside was something much more valuable. A wooden sailboat. Arthur had spent nearly 3 weeks carving it by hand in his tiny apartment workshop. Every evening after dinner, he would sand the wood until it felt as smooth as silk. He painted the tiny sails white and even carved Ethan's initials into the bottom. It wasn't a toy anyone could buy in a store. It was made with love. Arthur smiled to himself. Ethan's going to love this. For the first time in months, he actually felt excited. Thanksgiving had always been his favorite holiday. Not because of the food. Because it was the one day every year when family gathered around the same table. Or at least, that's how it used to be. 10 years earlier, Arthur's life had changed forever. His wife, Eleanor, had passed away after a short battle with cancer. 42 years of marriage. Gone in just 6 months. Arthur often said that when Eleanor died, half of his heart went with her. Friends encouraged him to remarry. His neighbors invited him to social clubs. Even his church tried to introduce him to other widows. Arthur politely refused every offer. No one replaces Eleanor. Instead, he poured every ounce of his love into his only son, Daniel. Arthur had raised Daniel with calloused hands and endless sacrifice. As a carpenter, Arthur wasn't rich. Not even close. There were winters when work disappeared completely. There were Christmases when Arthur skipped buying himself a coat so Daniel could have the bicycle he'd dreamed about. Arthur never complained. A father wasn't supposed to. He believed providing for his family wasn't generosity. It was responsibility. When Daniel earned a scholarship to college, Arthur secretly worked night shifts renovating restaurants to pay for everything the scholarship didn't cover. Daniel never knew. Arthur wanted his son focused on his dreams. Not on money. Years later, when Daniel wanted to start a construction company, the banks refused to lend him enough capital. Arthur quietly sold the home he and Eleanor had lived in for 38 years. The house where Daniel took his first steps. The house where every Christmas morning had been celebrated. Neighbors thought Arthur was downsizing because he was lonely. Nobody knew the truth. Every dollar from that sale went directly into Daniel's business. Arthur moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment across town. He told everyone he preferred a smaller place. That wasn't true. He simply wanted his son to succeed. Daniel cried when he learned what his father had done. "Dad, I can't take your house." Arthur smiled. "You aren't taking it. I'm investing it. And someday, you'll do even better for your own children." Daniel hugged him harder than he ever had before. For years, everything seemed worth it. Daniel's business flourished. He married Sophia. They bought a beautiful two-story home in an upscale neighborhood. Then Ethan was born. Arthur thought life couldn't get any better. From the day Ethan entered the world, the little boy became Arthur's shadow. Every Saturday morning, Arthur picked him up before sunrise. Together they went fishing at Silver Lake. Arthur taught him how to bait a hook, how to skip rocks, how to recognize birds by their songs. When Ethan turned 7, Arthur built him a treehouse with his own hands. No contractors. No blueprints. Just wood, nails, patience, and love. To Ethan, Grandpa wasn't just family. He was his hero. Whenever Ethan got scared during thunderstorms, he called Grandpa. Whenever he struggled with homework, he called Grandpa. Whenever he won a baseball game, the first person he wanted to tell was Grandpa. Arthur treasured every one of those phone calls. Not everyone appreciated Arthur the way Ethan did. Sophia's mother, Margaret Collins, never hid her opinion. Margaret came from old money, designer clothes, luxury vacations, country club memberships. Everything in her world was measured by wealth and status. Arthur's faded jeans, his 20-year-old pickup, and his modest apartment embarrassed her. At family gatherings, she often made comments disguised as jokes. "My goodness, Arthur. Do they still make shirts like that?" Or, "I almost didn't recognize you without sawdust on your boots." Everyone laughed awkwardly. Arthur simply smiled. He had learned long ago that arguing with pride only feeds it. Sophia usually changed the subject. Daniel pretended not to hear. Arthur told himself it didn't matter. After all, he wasn't there for Margaret. He was there for Ethan. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, Ethan called him. "Grandpa?" "Yes, buddy? This year can you sit next to me?" Arthur smiled so wide his cheeks hurt. "Of course. I saved your seat." "You did?" "Yep. I told Mom nobody else gets that chair." Arthur laughed. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Neither of them realized. Someone else had different plans. Thanksgiving morning finally arrived. Arthur woke before sunrise. He shaved carefully, pressed his favorite light blue shirt, polished his old leather shoes until they shined. He even wore the wristwatch Eleanor had given him on their 25th anniversary. Looking in the mirror, he whispered softly, "I hope you be proud of me." Then he picked up the wooden sailboat, wrapped it one last time, and drove toward Daniel's beautiful home. The neighborhood looked like something from a holiday movie. Children chased one another through piles of leaves. Neighbors waved happily. The smell of roasted turkey drifted through the air. Arthur parked at the curb and took a deep breath. This is going to be a good day. He had no idea. Those would be the last peaceful words he'd think all afternoon. Inside the house, relatives filled every room. Football played on the television. Children laughed upstairs. The kitchen buzzed with conversation. When Ethan spotted Arthur at the front door, he ran faster than anyone could stop him. "Grandpa." Arthur barely had time to kneel before Ethan threw both arms around his neck. "You came. I promised I would." Ethan noticed the wrapped box. "Is that for me?" Arthur winked. "Maybe." Daniel walked over and hugged his father. "Happy Thanksgiving, Dad. It's good to see you, son." For a brief moment, everything felt perfect. Then Arthur noticed Margaret watching from across the room. She didn't smile. She simply stared. As if she were already planning something. Arthur ignored the feeling. Surely today wasn't the day for conflict. Today was Thanksgiving. A day for gratitude. A day for family. Or so he believed. An hour later, everyone was called to the dining room. The long oak table sparkled beneath crystal glasses and polished silverware. 20 chairs surrounded it. Arthur immediately noticed one chair. Right beside Ethan. Exactly as the boy had promised. Ethan beamed and patted the seat. "Grandpa. Right here." Arthur smiled warmly and stepped toward the chair. He reached for the backrest. But before his fingers touched it, another hand grabbed it first. Arthur slowly looked up. Standing there, with a cold smile spreading across her face, was Margaret Collins. She pulled the chair away from the table. Then, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, she said, "I don't think this seat belongs to you." Arthur freezes as every conversation in the dining room stops. Ethan looks confused, Daniel looks down at the floor, and Margaret tightens her grip on the chair, setting the stage for a humiliation that no one in the family will ever forget. Arthur stopped in front of the chair, his hands still resting in the air. For a brief second, he thought Margaret was joking. He smiled politely. "Margaret. Ethan saved this seat for me." Margaret's smile didn't change. Instead, it grew colder. She slowly pulled the chair farther away from the table. "I heard what the boy said." She looked Arthur up and down before adding, "But children don't decide where adults sit." The room became strangely quiet. The conversations faded. Forks stopped moving. Even the football game playing in the living room seemed distant. Arthur glanced at Ethan. The little boy looked confused. "Grandma Margaret," Ethan said softly, "I saved Grandpa's seat." Margaret didn't even look at him. Instead, she called across the room, "Sophia." Sophia looked uncomfortable. "Yes, Mom? Didn't I tell you the seating arrangement this morning?" Sophia hesitated. "Yes. And did I leave an empty chair beside Ethan?" "No." Arthur frowned. He slowly looked around the table. There were enough chairs for everyone. No one else had been assigned to sit beside Ethan. Then why? Arthur forced a gentle smile. "It's all right. I can move one chair over." He reached toward another empty chair. Before he could touch it, Margaret blocked him again. "No." Arthur blinked. "No. We already have enough people at this table." Arthur looked around again. There was clearly enough space. He wasn't asking anyone to move. He wasn't taking anyone else's place. He simply wanted to sit beside his grandson. Daniel finally spoke. "Mom." His voice barely rose above a whisper. "Maybe Dad can just." Margaret cut him off. "I wasn't speaking to you." Daniel fell silent. Arthur couldn't believe what he was seeing. His own son, a successful businessman, looked afraid of his mother-in-law. Ethan climbed down from his chair. "I'll sit somewhere else." Arthur smiled sadly. "No, buddy. You stay where you are." "But Grandpa." Arthur gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's okay." Deep inside, it wasn't okay. Not even close. Margaret folded her arms. "I don't understand why this is becoming such a scene." Arthur replied calmly, "I don't want a scene. I only came to spend Thanksgiving with my family." Margaret laughed. "Family?" The word dripped with sarcasm. "Arthur, let's be honest. You don't exactly fit in here anymore." Several relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. One aunt quietly looked down at her plate. An uncle cleared his throat. Nobody said anything. Arthur felt every eye in the room. Yet no one defended him. Margaret continued. "You live in a tiny apartment. You drive that rusty pickup. You wear clothes older than Ethan." She shrugged. "This dinner represents success." Arthur answered quietly. "I've never measured success by money." Margaret smirked. That's because you've never had any. A few relatives gasped. Daniel looked horrified. Dad. He finally spoke. I'm sorry. Arthur raised one hand. It's all right. He refused to let his son see how deeply those words hurt. The smell of roasted turkey suddenly made Arthur feel sick. Only minutes earlier, he had been excited. Now, he wished he had never come. He looked toward Ethan. The little boy's eyes were already filling with tears. Arthur couldn't bear it. He smiled anyway. A fake smile. One that hid years of pain. Margaret suddenly snapped her fingers toward one of the catering assistants helping in the kitchen. You. The young woman walked over nervously. Yes, ma'am. Take one plate outside. Arthur frowned. Outside? Margaret nodded. Yes. If someone insists on coming without contributing, they can eat on the patio. Arthur stared at her. I brought dessert. I also brought Ethan a gift. Margaret waved dismissively. A homemade toy isn't exactly a contribution. Arthur's fingers tightened around the small wrapped sailboat. 3 weeks of work. Dismissed in one sentence. Ethan couldn't stay quiet anymore. That's my present. I wanted Grandpa to make it. Margaret looked at him sharply. Ethan. Sit down. No. The room froze again. It was the first time Ethan had ever openly disagreed with an adult. Sophia quickly stood. Ethan. The boy shook his head. No. Grandpa belongs with us. Arthur knelt beside him. Buddy. It's okay. No, it isn't. Tears rolled down Ethan's cheeks. Arthur hugged him tightly. He whispered. Sometimes being kind means walking away from people who forget how to be kind. Ethan buried his face against Arthur's shoulder. I don't want you to leave. Arthur kissed the boy's forehead. I'll always be with you. Arthur slowly picked up the wooden sailboat. He placed it gently into Ethan's hands. I made this for you. So you'll remember. No matter where life takes you, a steady heart will always find its way home. Ethan hugged the sailboat as if it were priceless. Because to him, it was. Arthur turned toward the front door. Every step felt heavier than the last. Not one relative stopped him. Not one cousin. Not one aunt. Not one uncle. Daniel stood frozen. His lips trembled. But he never moved. Arthur reached the door. He quietly opened it. The cold November wind rushed inside. Without looking back, he stepped onto the patio. The door slowly closed behind him. Inside, the family returned to their seats. Outside, Arthur sat alone at a small metal table. A paper plate holding turkey, mashed potatoes, and stuffing was placed in front of him. He looked at it for several seconds. Then quietly whispered. So this is what I've become. A single tear rolled down his weathered face. Inside the dining room, Ethan stared through the glass door. He could see his grandfather sitting alone in the cold. The little boy looked around the table. Every adult had lowered their eyes. Nobody was eating. Nobody was speaking. Something inside Ethan changed. Slowly, he stood up. He picked up his dinner plate. Then he looked directly at Margaret. His young voice was calm, but stronger than anyone had ever heard before. If Grandpa eats outside, then I'm eating outside too. The room fell into complete silence. Ethan walks toward the patio with his dinner plate in his hands. Margaret orders him to stop, but the 9-year-old keeps walking. As he reaches the door, he turns back and says, before anyone takes another bite, there's something all of you need to know. The entire dining room froze. No one reached for their food. No one dared to speak. Every pair of eyes followed 9-year-old Ethan as he stood holding his dinner plate with one hand and the handmade wooden sailboat with the other. Margaret folded her arms. "Ethan." Her voice was sharp. "Sit back down." The boy didn't move. I said, "Sit." Ethan slowly shook his head. "No." Sophia stood so quickly that her chair scraped loudly across the hardwood floor. "Ethan, please don't make this harder." The boy looked at his mother with tears in his eyes. "I'm not making it harder." "You are." The words hit Sophia like a punch. She opened her mouth to respond. But nothing came out. Outside, Arthur sat quietly at the small patio table. The November wind had grown colder. The paper napkin beneath his plate fluttered in the breeze. He hadn't taken a single bite. Instead, he stared at the tiny lights hanging around Daniel's backyard fence. Those lights reminded him of Christmases long ago, when Daniel was just a little boy. Arthur remembered carrying him on his shoulders to hang decorations. He remembered Eleanor laughing as she burned the first batch of cookies every year. He remembered promises. Promises that family would always come first. Arthur sighed. "So much changes," he whispered. The patio door suddenly slid open. Arthur looked up. There stood Ethan. Holding his plate. Holding the sailboat. Smiling through tears. "I found you." Arthur forced a smile. "What are you doing out here?" Ethan placed his dinner on the table. "I'm having Thanksgiving with my grandpa." Arthur gently shook his head. "Buddy. Your parents are waiting." Ethan answered without hesitation. "My family is waiting." "You are my family." Arthur felt his throat tighten. He had spent years teaching Ethan kindness. Now, the child was teaching it back. Inside the dining room, chaos quietly spread. One aunt whispered, "This doesn't look good." Another relative muttered, "Margaret has gone too far." Daniel remained standing beside his chair. His face was pale. His hands trembled. His wife walked over. "Daniel. You need to do something." Daniel stared through the glass door. He watched his father brushing leaves off the chair so Ethan wouldn't get dirty. Exactly as he had done every time Daniel was little. The memory hit him like lightning. Suddenly, he wasn't seeing an old man outside. He was seeing the father who worked 16-hour days. The father who never missed a baseball game. The father who skipped meals so his son could eat. Guilt began crushing him. Margaret noticed Daniel staring. She stepped beside him. "Don't start feeling sorry now." Daniel looked at her. "What?" He chose this life. He could have been successful. He chose to stay poor. Daniel frowned. "You don't know anything about my father." Margaret smiled confidently. "Oh, I know enough. He never gave your family anything. My husband paid for your wedding. My money helped you buy this house. Our family made you successful." Daniel slowly looked away. For years. That was exactly what Margaret had told everyone. And eventually, he had started believing it. Outside, Ethan finally noticed that Arthur hadn't touched his food. "Aren't you hungry?" Arthur smiled. "I've eaten plenty in my life." The boy frowned. "That's not an answer." Arthur laughed softly. "No. I guess it isn't." Ethan broke off a piece of turkey with his fork. "Open." Arthur blinked. "What?" "I'm feeding you." Arthur chuckled. "I can feed myself." "I know. But I want to." Arthur opened his mouth. The little boy held out the fork. Arthur took the bite. His eyes immediately filled with tears. Not because of the food. Because nobody had cared for him like that. Since Eleanor died. At that exa. CT moment. Someone inside the house quietly began recording everything on their phone. One of Daniel's younger cousins whispered, "People need to see this." Another cousin shook his head. "No. This should never have happened." Arthur looked toward Ethan. "You know something?" "What?" "I'm proud of you." Ethan smiled. "I'm proud of you too." Arthur laughed. "What did I do?" "You didn't yell. You didn't hit anybody. You stayed kind. My teacher says that's what real heroes do." Arthur couldn't speak. He simply reached over and squeezed Ethan's hand. Inside, Margaret slammed her wine glass onto the table. "This is ridiculous." She marched toward the patio. Sophia tried stopping her. "Mom. Please." Margaret ignored her. She threw open the patio door. "There you are." Arthur slowly stood. "What now, Margaret? You've embarrassed this family enough." Arthur looked genuinely confused. "I embarrassed the family?" "Yes. Everyone's talking. They're staring." Arthur answered quietly. "No, Margaret. They're staring because they finally saw who embarrassed the family." Margaret's face turned red. "You think you're some kind of victim?" Arthur didn't answer. There was no point. Some people never listened. They only waited for their turn to speak. Margaret pointed toward Ethan. "Come inside." "No. I wasn't asking." "I know. I'm still not coming." Margaret's patience snapped. She stepped toward Ethan. Before she could grab his arm, Arthur calmly moved between them. His voice remained gentle. "Don't touch him." Margaret glared at him. "Move." "No." For the first time that afternoon, Arthur wasn't backing away. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. He simply stood there, protecting his grandson. The silence became unbearable. Then, Ethan looked down at the wooden sailboat. He carefully placed it on the table. "There was something I wanted to show Grandpa." Arthur frowned. "What is it?" Ethan reached into the pocket of his hoodie. He pulled out an old brass key. Arthur looked confused. "Where did you get that?" "In Dad's office." Daniel stepped outside just in time to hear those words. His face instantly changed. "Ethan, where did you find that key?" "In the old wooden box." Arthur froze. "What wooden box?" Daniel swallowed hard. "The one I've never opened." Arthur's heartbeat quickened. He knew exactly which box Daniel meant. Years ago, after Eleanor died, Arthur had given Daniel a locked cedar box. Inside, he had placed letters, family photographs, and important documents. Daniel had promised never to open it unless there was a day when the family needed the truth more than comfort. Arthur had almost forgotten it existed. Daniel stared at the key in Ethan's hand. His voice was barely audible. "I think it's finally time." Daniel walks silently into his home and returns carrying an old cedar box, covered in dust. Arthur recognizes it instantly. The box his late wife made him promise would remain sealed unless the family was on the verge of tearing itself apart. With trembling hands, Daniel places it on the patio table, and Arthur slowly reaches for the lock. The backyard had fallen completely silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the laughter from neighboring homes seemed to disappear as Daniel walked out of the house carrying an old cedar box in both hands. Dust covered its surface. The brass corners had darkened with age. A tiny engraved plaque on the front read only 2 words. "For family." Arthur's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't seen that box in almost 10 years. His fingers trembled as Daniel carefully placed it on the patio table. The old wood creaked against the metal surface. Ethan looked from his grandfather to his father. "What's inside?" Arthur swallowed hard. A lifetime. 20 years earlier. After Eleanor's funeral, Arthur had spent an entire week alone in the garage. He wasn't building furniture. He wasn't repairing tools. He was building this box. Every piece of cedar had been hand-cut. Every joint had been carved without nails. Inside, he placed the things that mattered most. Letters. Receipts. Photographs. Legal papers. Memories. And one sealed envelope Eleanor had written before she died. When Daniel came to visit after the funeral, Arthur handed him the box. "If our family ever forgets who we are," Arthur had said quietly, "open this." Daniel remembered those exact words. But life became busy. The business grew. Marriage. Children. Success. The box disappeared into a storage cabinet in his office. Forgotten. Until today. Arthur stared at the small brass key still resting in Ethan's hand. "May I?" The boy nodded and placed it in his grandfather's palm. Arthur slid the key into the lock. His hand shook so badly he missed the keyhole twice. Finally. Click. The lock opened. Arthur slowly lifted the lid. The familiar smell of cedar filled the cold afternoon air. Inside lay dozens of neatly organized envelopes tied together with faded blue ribbon. Every envelope had a handwritten label. Daniel's college. Business loan. Wedding. House. Family photos. And at the very bottom, one white envelope. Its seal remained unbroken. Across the front, in Eleanor's elegant handwriting, were the words, "Only when the truth is being buried." Arthur closed his eyes. He could almost hear Eleanor's voice. Margaret folded her arms. "Oh, for heaven's sake. A box of old papers isn't going to change anything." Arthur ignored her. Instead, he picked up the first bundle. Daniel's college. He untied the ribbon. Inside were dozens of canceled checks. Tuition receipts. Housing payments. Book invoices. Every payment had Arthur's name on it. Daniel stared in disbelief. "I thought my scholarship covered everything." Arthur smiled sadly. "It covered about half. The rest, I never wanted you to worry about." Daniel's eyes widened. "You worked extra jobs." Arthur nodded. "Every weekend. I remodeled restaurants. I repaired church pews. I built kitchen cabinets. I did whatever I had to. So you could study instead of worrying." Daniel's knees felt weak. For years, he had believed college had been easy. He had never known the cost. Arthur opened another envelope. Business loan. Inside were bank records. Mortgage papers. Property sale documents. Arthur unfolded one faded sheet. It showed the sale of his own family home. Sale price. Every cent transferred into Daniel's business account. Daniel grabbed the paper. His hands began shaking. "No. No. This can't be." Arthur looked at him gently. "It can. I never borrowed against the house. I sold it." Daniel slowly looked up. "You sold Mom's house?" Arthur nodded. "You said the bank rejected your business loan. I couldn't let your dream die." Daniel covered his face. For nearly 15 years, he had believed investors helped him start the company. He never realized his father had sacrificed everything. Sophia stepped closer. "Arthur, why didn't you tell us?" Arthur smiled softly. "Because love isn't supposed to send invoices. It simply gives." Those words echoed through the backyard. Even relatives watching from the dining room doorway began crying. Margaret interrupted. "So what? You helped your son. Parents do that." Arthur calmly opened another envelope. This one read, "House." Inside was a cashier's check. The amount matched the down payment Daniel had used to buy the very house they stood in. Arthur handed it to Daniel. "I thought you deserved a better neighborhood." Daniel looked ready to collapse. He turned toward Margaret. "You told me. Your family paid the down payment." Margaret's confident expression cracked for the first time. There must be some misunderstanding." Arthur quietly reached deeper into the envelope. He removed a handwritten note. It was signed by Margaret herself. Daniel recognized her handwriting immediately. The note read, "Arthur, thank you for helping with the down payment. Please don't mention it to Daniel. I want him to believe my family handled this. It will make future discussions much easier." Silence. Complete silence. Daniel reread the note. Once. Twice. 3 times. His face turned pale. "You lied." Margaret forced a laugh. "It wasn't a lie. It was a simplification." "A simplification?" Daniel's voice rose. "You stole my father's sacrifice." Sophia slowly backed away from her mother. "Mom, tell me this isn't true." Margaret said nothing. That silence answered everything. One uncle whispered, "My God." Another aunt quietly wiped tears from her eyes. The younger cousins exchanged shocked looks. Everything they believed about the family had begun to unravel. Arthur wasn't smiling. He wasn't celebrating. Instead, he looked exhausted. "I never wanted anyone to feel guilty. I simply wanted my family." His voice broke. "I would have eaten outside forever, if it meant Ethan stayed happy." Ethan immediately hugged his grandfather around the waist. "You'll never eat outside again." Arthur gently rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. Daniel suddenly walked toward his father. Without saying a word, he dropped to his knees. The successful businessman, the respected company owner, the man who had employees looking up to him, knelt before the carpenter who had built his life. Tears streamed down his face. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Dad. I believed lies. I stopped asking questions. I forgot everything you did for me." Arthur quickly helped him up. "No. A father doesn't keep score." Daniel hugged him tightly. For the first time in years, Arthur felt like he had his son back. Margaret looked around. No one stood beside her anymore. Even Sophia had quietly moved to Arthur's side. The woman who had controlled the family's opinions for years suddenly realized she was standing alone. Her voice became desperate. "You're all overreacting. They're just old documents. They don't prove everything." Arthur looked into the cedar box once more. "There is still one envelope left." Everyone turned toward the bottom of the box. The sealed white envelope. The one Eleanor had written before she died. Arthur stared at it for a long moment. "I've never opened this." Daniel frowned. "You've never read Mom's last letter?" Arthur slowly shook his head. "She made me promise." Daniel carefully picked up the envelope. The wax seal was untouched. Across the front, Eleanor had written one final sentence. "If this letter is ever opened, it means someone has mistaken kindness for weakness." Arthur took a deep breath. His fingers rested on the edge of the seal. Then, very slowly, he began to break it. As the wax seal cracked open, a folded letter slipped out, along with a small photograph that fluttered onto the patio floor. Ethan picked it up before anyone else could. His eyes widened in shock as he whispered, "Grandpa, why is Grandma standing next to Margaret, and why are they shaking hands in front of our house 25 years ago?" Arthur's face drained of color. He recognized the photograph instantly. It captured the day everything had quietly begun to fall apart. The photograph slipped from Ethan's trembling hands onto the patio table. Every eye fixed on it. Arthur slowly picked it up. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. The picture had been taken 25 years earlier. He remembered the day perfectly. It was the afternoon he and Eleanor had signed the final papers for the house where Daniel grew up. Standing beside them was a much younger Margaret Collins. She was smiling. Friendly. Respectful. Nothing like the woman standing in front of him now. Daniel frowned. "Dad, why was Margaret there?" Arthur looked at the photograph for a long moment before answering. "Because, before she became your mother-in-law, she was our real estate agent." A wave of surprise swept through the family. Margaret's face instantly lost its color. Arthur slowly unfolded Eleanor's final letter. The paper had yellowed with age. Her graceful handwriting filled both sides. His hands trembled so violently that Daniel gently held the bottom of the page. Arthur cleared his throat. His voice cracked as he began reading aloud. "My dearest Arthur. If you are reading this, then our family has reached a point I prayed would never come. If kindness has been mistaken for weakness, the truth must finally be told." Arthur stopped for a second. He could almost hear Eleanor's voice. He continued. "Years ago, Margaret Collins came to me with a proposal. She believed Daniel had a bright future and told me that wealthy families respected appearances more than sacrifice. She asked us to stay quiet about everything you had done for our son. She wanted people to believe her connections and her family's money created Daniel's success. I refused. But she promised it would only be temporary." Arthur lowered the paper. The silence became suffocating. Daniel slowly turned toward Margaret. "You knew?" Margaret stared at the ground. Arthur continued reading. "Arthur. I know your heart. You will probably forgive her before she ever apologizes. That is who you are. But if this lie continues after I'm gone, our son may someday forget where he came from." Daniel covered his face. Every sentence felt like his mother was speaking directly to him. Arthur turned the page. His breathing grew heavier. "There is one final document beneath this letter. If our family ever becomes divided because of pride, give it to Daniel." Arthur reached inside the envelope. His fingers touched another folded sheet. He slowly pulled it out. It wasn't a letter. It was a notarized legal agreement. Attached to it were copies of bank transfers, property deeds, and business investment records. Every signature had been witnessed. Every payment documented. Every sacrifice recorded. There was no room left for lies. Daniel scanned the first page. His knees nearly gave out. Every milestone in his life had one name beside it. Arthur Bennett. College. Arthur. Business. Arthur. Wedding. Arthur. House. Arthur. Emergency loan after the recession. Arthur. Medical bills after Ethan was born. Arthur. Even the trust fund created for Ethan's education. Arthur. Daniel's hands began shaking uncontrollably. "My entire life was built by you." Arthur smiled softly. "I was your father. That's what fathers do." Daniel suddenly turned toward Margaret. His eyes were filled with tears and disappointment. "For 15 years. You told me your family rescued me. You told me Dad had nothing left to give." Margaret tried speaking. "I was only trying to." Daniel interrupted. "You stole my father's dignity." Sophia stepped forward. She looked at her mother with tears streaming down her face. "I defended you. I believed you. You made me think Arthur was lucky to be invited into this family." She looked toward Arthur. "When all this time, we were the lucky ones." Arthur simply nodded. He wasn't interested in humiliating anyone. He never had been. Margaret suddenly raised her voice. Fine. Yes. I lied. I wanted Daniel to aim higher. I wanted people to admire our family. I couldn't let everyone think his success came from a carpenter. The words echoed across the backyard. Several relatives gasped. Arthur lowered his head. Not because he was ashamed. Because after all these years, he finally understood why Margaret had always looked at him with contempt. To her, his profession had always been something to hide. Before anyone could respond, Ethan quietly walked over to Margaret. The little boy looked up into her eyes. His voice was calm, soft, but every word landed like thunder. My grandpa builds things. He built houses. He built Dad's business. He built this family. But you. He paused. You only built lies. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Margaret opened her mouth. But no words came. For the first time in years, she had no answer. Arthur gently rested his hand on Ethan's shoulder. You shouldn't hate anyone. Ethan looked confused. But she hurt you. Arthur smiled sadly. Hate only builds another prison. Truth sets people free. Daniel looked at his father with admiration. Even now, after everything, Arthur chose compassion over revenge. Just as the family believed the painful truth had finally come to light. A black sedan slowly pulled into the driveway. Everyone turned. A middle-aged man stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. Daniel recognized him immediately. Mr. Harris? The man nodded. Good afternoon. I'm sorry to interrupt Thanksgiving. Arthur frowned. Who is he? Daniel answered quietly. Our family attorney. Mr. Harris looked directly at Arthur. I've been trying to reach you for weeks. Arthur looked puzzled. Why? The lawyer opened his briefcase. He removed a thick sealed file. Across the front were the words. The estate of Eleanor Bennett. Mr. Harris looked around the silent family before saying. Mrs. Bennett left instructions that this file should only be delivered if Arthur Bennett was ever publicly humiliated by his own family. Margaret's face turned completely white. Daniel's heartbeat thundered in his ear. Arthur stared at the file in disbelief. I never knew. Mr. Harris nodded. She made sure you wouldn't. He carefully placed the sealed file into Arthur's hands. Arthur looked at the familiar handwriting on the front. Then, very slowly, he broke the seal. Inside the file was Eleanor's final legal instruction. Arthur's eyes widened as he read the first line. He looked at Daniel in disbelief, then at Ethan, and whispered. She knew this day would come. The lawyer quietly added. Mr. Bennett, your wife's final decision changes everything. The family held its breath, knowing that whatever came next would alter their lives forever. Arthur held the thick file in both hands. For several long seconds, he simply stared at Eleanor's familiar handwriting. His vision blurred with tears. It had been 10 years since she passed away. Yet somehow, it felt as if she were standing beside him once again. The entire family watched in silence. The wind gently rustled the autumn leaves across the patio. Even Margaret, who had spent years controlling every conversation, remained speechless. Arthur slowly opened the file. The first page contained only one sentence. In Eleanor's elegant handwriting, it read. If you are reading this, Arthur, then someone has forgotten that love built this family, not money. Arthur closed his eyes. A tear rolled down his cheek. Daniel lowered his head. Sophia quietly held Ethan's hand. Behind the letter was a legal document signed by Eleanor, Arthur, and their attorney nearly 10 years earlier. Mr. Harris stepped forward. I prepared these documents personally. Arthur looked at him. I don't understand. Mr. Harris nodded respectfully. Mrs. Bennett asked me to create a family trust before she passed away. Daniel looked confused. A trust? Mr. Harris continued. Yes. Mrs. Bennett believed that wealth should never reward pride. So she created strict conditions. Arthur had never seen these papers. He frowned. I never signed this. Mr. Harris smiled gently. You did. You signed several estate documents after Mrs. Bennett passed away. She specifically asked that you never read this section unless today's situation occurred. Arthur looked down again. Every signature on the papers was genuine. Mr. Harris read aloud. If Arthur Bennett is ever intentionally humiliated, rejected, or publicly dishonored by members of his own immediate family because of his financial status or social position, the Bennett Family Trust shall immediately transfer full decision-making authority to Arthur Bennett. The relatives gasped. Daniel looked stunned. Mr. Harris continued reading. No member of the family shall receive future financial distributions until Arthur Bennett determines they have restored the values of kindness, honesty, and respect that built this family. Silence. Complete silence. Margaret Slow. Ly stepped backward. What? What does that mean? Mr. Harris answered calmly. It means Mrs. Bennett wanted character, not ego, to guide the family's future. Daniel looked at his father. His eyes filled with shame. Dad. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Arthur didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly closed the file. He looked around the backyard. At his son. His daughter-in-law. His grandson. The relatives. And finally, Margaret. Margaret suddenly found her voice. This is ridiculous. She can't control people from the grave. Mr. Harris calmly replied. No. But legally binding estate documents certainly can. Margaret's confidence disappeared. For years she had believed money gave her power. Now, truth had taken it away. Daniel walked toward his father. He wasn't the confident businessman anymore. He looked like a little boy again. The same boy who once scraped his knees learning to ride a bicycle. The same boy Arthur had carried home after baseball practice. He stopped a few feet away. Then, without caring who watched, he dropped to his knees. Dad. I failed you. I forgot where I came from. I believed lies because they were easier than remembering your sacrifices. His voice broke. When Mom died, I promised I'd take care of you. Instead, I let you eat outside. Arthur's own tears began falling. He gently lifted Daniel back to his feet. My son. The greatest mistake isn't falling. It's refusing to stand again. Daniel hugged his father with all his strength. Neither of them cared who was watching. Years of distance began disappearing in that embrace. Sophia slowly approached Arthur. She could barely speak. I owe you an apology. I judged you through someone else's eyes. I should have listened to Ethan. Arthur smiled kindly. We all make mistakes. The important part is what we choose after them. Sophia nodded through tears. I choose family. Then Arthur turned toward Margaret. She stood completely alone. Not one relative stood beside her. For the first time in her life, status couldn't save her. She tried speaking. I'm. The words wouldn't come. Arthur quietly walked over to her. Everyone expected anger. Everyone expected revenge. Instead, Arthur extended his hand. Margaret looked at it in disbelief. You still want to shake my hand? Arthur nodded. I don't. I want you to understand something. He lowered his hand. You embarrassed me. But the greatest punishment isn't humiliation. It's realizing you've spent years pushing away the people who could have loved you. Margaret's shoulders collapsed. For the first time, she cried. Not because she had lost influence, but because she finally understood what she had destroyed. Ethan walked over holding the handmade wooden sailboat. He looked at his grandfather. Grandpa? Yes, buddy? Can we eat Thanksgiving dinner now? Arthur smiled. I'd like that very much. Daniel looked toward the dining room. Then he pulled out the chair beside Ethan. No one else touched it. He looked at Arthur. This seat has always belonged to you. Arthur slowly sat down. This time, no one stopped him. Ethan slipped his small hand into Arthur's. I told you I'd save your seat. Arthur smiled through tears. And you kept your promise. The family gathered around the table once more. But before anyone began eating, Arthur stood. He looked around the room. I've spent my whole life building houses. I always believed the strongest part wasn't the roof. It was the foundation. He paused. A family is the same. You can have a beautiful home, expensive furniture, luxury cars. But if respect isn't your foundation, everything eventually collapses. Every person at the table listened. No interruptions. No arguments. Only truth. Arthur raised his glass. To Eleanor. The woman who knew that kindness would one day win. Everyone quietly raised their glasses. To Eleanor. That Thanksgiving became known in the Bennett family as the day truth took its seat at the table. Margaret spent months apologizing, not with words alone, but with changed behavior. Daniel visited Arthur every weekend, just as he had when he was a child. Sophia made sure Arthur never spent another holiday alone. And Ethan kept the handmade sailboat on a shelf in his bedroom. Whenever friends asked why it meant so much, he smiled and said, My grandpa made this. He also taught me the most important lesson I'll ever learn. They can take away your chair, but they can never take away your dignity. The end. Respect your parents while you still have them. The people who sacrifice the most for us often ask for the least in return. Never mistake kindness for weakness, because the truth always finds its seat at the table.